London, 1933. A man was lying in a bathtub. Leo Szilard was not by reputation a man who moved quickly. He slept late, he thought slowly and carefully, he soaked in hot water and let his mind work without forcing it, the way that certain kinds of minds only work when the body is doing nothing at all. On this particular morning, in a hotel bathroom in London, his mind was working on a question that no one had yet thought to ask seriously. What if you could split an atom? And what if splitting one released enough energy to split two more? And what if those two split four? And what if 4 split 8? And 8 split 16? And 16 split 32? And the chain kept doubling, exponentially, unstoppably, in the fraction of a second before anything could be done to interrupt it. What would that be? Szilard lay in the bathtub and understood with the particular cold clarity of a man who has just seen something that cannot be unseen exactly what it would be. It would be a weapon, the kind of weapon that had never existed before, the kind of weapon that in the right hands could end a war in a single morning. And then he thought about whose hands might get there first. Germany, 1933, the year Hitler came to power, the year the Jews of Europe began to understand what was coming, the year the best scientists in Germany started to disappear into exile, into hiding, into the laboratories of countries that were not yet at war but would be. Szilard got out of the bathtub. He had work to do. What he set in motion that morning in London would take 12 years, $2 billion, the combined scientific genius of a generation of refugees, and the full industrial capacity of the United States to complete. It would end one war, it would begin something else entirely, and the word for what it began has not yet been fully invented. The Manhattan Project is remembered as the greatest scientific achievement in human history. The moment when theoretical physics became industrial reality, when the equations on blackboards became a flash of light visible for 200 miles and a shockwave that turned sand to glass. It is also the moment when human beings discovered something that no previous civilization had been forced to confront, that knowledge, once acquired, cannot be unacquired, that a weapon, once invented, cannot be uninvented, that the men who built the most destructive thing in history could not, having built it, simply choose not to have built it. They tried. 155 of them signed a petition asking that it not be used on cities. 83% of the scientists consulted said some form of demonstration was preferable to killing civilians. The men who'd spent 3 years building the thing that was about to be dropped on Hiroshima asked, formally and in writing, for it not to be dropped on Hiroshima. The petition was suppressed. The bombers were already on Tinian Island. The decision had been made by people who needed the scientists to build the thing but did not need the scientists to decide how to use it. This is the story of what the Manhattan Project actually was. Not the triumph, the weight, the thing that the men who built it carried for the rest of their lives, and the question they left for everyone who came after them. To understand what drove the Manhattan Project, you must first understand what Europe felt like to a Jewish physicist in 1933. Before Hitler, Germany produced more Nobel Prizes in science than any other country in the world. The universities of Berlin and Göttingen were the centres of theoretical physics, the places where the questions about the nature of matter and energy and the structure of the universe were being asked with the greatest sophistication and the greatest rigour. If you wanted to be at the frontier of what physics knew, you went to Germany. After Hitler came to power, the frontier moved. One by one, the scientists left. Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, Enrico Fermi, who used his trip to Stockholm to collect his Nobel Prize as cover for a permanent departure. His wife was Jewish, and the Italian racial laws were coming. Albert Einstein, who was in California when Hitler became Chancellor and never went back. Leo Szilard, who had already been thinking in his bathtub 5 years earlier. They arrived in the United States carrying the most dangerous knowledge in human history in their heads. And in 1938, news arrived from Germany that made that knowledge suddenly terrifyingly urgent. German scientists had split the atom. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, had bombarded uranium with neutrons and produced barium, which meant the uranium nucleus had divided. Fission. The thing Szilard had been thinking about in the bathtub 5 years earlier was no longer theoretical, it was experimental fact. And it was happening in a country run by a man who had already demonstrated with absolute clarity what he intended to do with the power he accumulated. The implications were understood immediately by every physicist who heard the news. If Germany was pursuing fission, if the chain reaction that Szilard had imagined in London was being engineered in Berlin, then the question was not whether an atomic bomb would be built. The question was who would build it first. Szilard could not go to President Roosevelt himself. A Hungarian-accented refugee physicist telling an American president that a new kind of bomb was theoretically possible was not, as one observer noted, a conversation that was going to go well. He needed someone whose name carried weight. He needed Einstein. Edward Teller drove Szilard to Einstein's summer house on Long Island. Einstein listened, asked a few questions, said yes. The letter they drafted together, signed by Einstein, written largely by Szilard, reached Roosevelt in October 1939, 6 weeks after Germany invaded Poland. Roosevelt formed an advisory committee. The committee moved slowly. The war in Europe was 2 months old and occupied everyone's attention. The bomb was theoretical. The physicists were refugees with accents. The committee did what committees do with things they do not fully understand. They noted them and moved on. Then Pearl Harbor happened and everything changed.
The Manhattan Project was not a scientific endeavor in any conventional sense. It was a scientific endeavor conducted at the scale and pace of an industrial mobilization against a deadline set by the fear that the enemy was closer than they were. General Leslie Groves, who had just finished building the Pentagon and considered this assignment a demotion, was put in charge of turning theoretical physics into a deliverable weapon in the shortest possible time. He was an engineer and an administrator, not a scientist. He did not fully understand what the scientists were building. He understood schedules, budgets, and the organizational logic of large-scale construction projects. What he built was extraordinary. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, became a city of 75,000 people, whose residents were instructed, when asked what they did, to say they made the holes for the donuts. The electromagnetic separation plant at Y12 used 15,000 tons of silver borrowed from the US Treasury because copper was in short supply. The gaseous diffusion plant at K25 was the largest building ever constructed, half a mile long, 1,000 feet wide, consuming 10% of the electrical power generated in the entire United States. And in the mountains of New Mexico, at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer assembled the most concentrated gathering of scientific genius in human history and was told to turn it into a weapon. J. Robert Oppenheimer was not the obvious choice. He was brilliant, a theoretical physicist who had never run anything larger than a university department, who lived on coffee and martinis and cigarettes, who had connections to left-wing politics that made the security services nervous from the beginning. Groves was told he would be a disaster, that he couldn't run a hot dog stand. Groves chose him anyway, because Groves understood something that the security services did not, that what Los Alamos needed was not an administrator, it was a man that other brilliant men would follow, and Oppenheimer was that man. He drew Fermi and Bethe and Teller and dozens of others to the mountains of New Mexico. The laboratory grew from 250 people in 1943 to 2,500 in 1945. Babies were born. Groves asked Oppenheimer if he could do something about the birth rate. Oppenheimer said he didn't think so. They worked on problems that had no precedent in engineering history. How do you bring two subcritical masses of uranium together fast enough to prevent the spontaneously emitted neutrons from causing the reaction to fizzle? How do you compress a sphere of plutonium symmetrically enough that the shock wave drives inward uniformly? How do you build something that has never existed before, on a schedule set by a war, with materials that have to be produced at industrial scale for the first time in history? They worked, and they worried, and the question that none of them could escape, the question that ran beneath all the technical problems like a current beneath a river, was what they were actually building this for.
May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe, the war that had started everything, the war that had made the bomb necessary, the war whose existence had justified everything that had been done at Oak Ridge and Hanford and Los Alamos, was over. Japan had not surrendered. The war in the Pacific continued, but Germany, the Germany of Hitler and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and the physicists who had discovered fission and the regime that had caused every refugee in Los Alamos to flee their homes, was finished. And in June 1945, 155 scientists of the Manhattan Project sat down and wrote a petition. They had built the bomb to stop Hitler. Hitler was dead. The petition asked that before the bomb was used against Japan, against Japanese cities, against Japanese civilians, there should be a demonstration. Drop it on an inhabited area. Show Japan what it could do. Give them the chance to surrender before the cities burned. 83% of the scientists consulted supported some form of demonstration over direct use against civilians. General Groves heard about the petition and ordered that it not be circulated at Los Alamos. Then, to undermine it, he conducted a poll, and when the poll came back showing that most scientists wanted a demonstration, he ensured that the petition was bottled up at Oak Ridge until after the bombs fell on Japan. The men who'd built the weapon were not permitted to influence the decision about its use. The knowledge was theirs, the decision was not. The bombers were already on Tinian Island. The targets had been selected months earlier, cities that had been deliberately spared from conventional bombing raids in order to preserve them as demonstration sites for what atomic weapons could do. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, cities saved in order to be destroyed. The petition never reached Truman.
July 16th, 1945, 5:30 in the morning. The desert of New Mexico was cold before dawn. The scientists lay on the ground facing away from the tower, 100 feet high, at the centre of the test site. Some were 20 miles away. Edward Teller was putting suntan lotion on his face and hands at 20 miles because the ultraviolet radiation from the detonation was a genuine concern at that distance. Nobody knew for certain that the bomb would work. A test of the explosives surrounding the plutonium core had failed days earlier. Sensors showed the explosives had not fired simultaneously. If they had not fired simultaneously in a test, they might not fire simultaneously in the real device. And if they did not fire simultaneously, the plutonium would not be compressed symmetrically. And if the plutonium was not compressed symmetrically, there would be no bomb. There would be a very expensive conventional explosion in the New Mexico desert, and the war would continue, and the invasion of Japan would proceed as planned. General Groves lay on the ground in the prone position, facing away from the blast, thinking about what he would tell Washington if the timer reached 0 and nothing happened. At 5:30 a.m., the timer reached 0. What happened next had never happened before in the history of the world. The flash came first, so intense that it was visible for 200 miles. that it heated the faces of men lying on the ground 20 miles away, the way a sunrise heats a face, except that a sunrise takes minutes and this took a fraction of a second. The ball of fire rose 40,000 feet. The desert sand within 800 yards of the detonation point was vitrified, melted into glass by the heat. The steel tower that had held the device was completely vaporized. The shockwave arrived after the light, the way thunder arrives after lightning, and when it hit the men lying on the ground, they felt it in their chests before they heard it. The bomb had worked. The yield was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, the high end of most estimates. Oppenheimer stood up from the desert floor. He thought of a line from the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Hindu scripture he had read in the original Sanskrit because he had taught himself Sanskrit, because that was the kind of man he was. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He said it quietly, to no one in particular. The men around him were too stunned to speak. The desert was silent except for the wind, and in the silence, the specific weight of what had just happened, what they had just demonstrated was possible, what was now going to be used, what could never be unused, settled over the Jornada del Muerto like the fallout that was already drifting downwind. 3 weeks later, the Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island in the pre-dawn darkness and flew towards Japan.
August 6, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. Hiroshima was a city of 350,000 people. It was a Monday morning. The factories were opening. Children were going to school. Trams were running. The air raid siren had sounded earlier. A single B-29 had been spotted, probably a weather plane, but it had sounded and nothing had happened, so people had come out of the shelters and returned to their mornings. At 8:15, Little Boy detonated 1,900 feet above the city. The fireball reached a temperature of several million degrees. The pressure wave moved outward at 500 miles an hour. 90% of the city was leveled. People directly beneath the detonation point were incinerated so completely that some left only shadows burned into stone. People at the edges of the blast zone were still alive, burned over most of their bodies, stripped of clothing, walking in the direction they had been walking before they understood what had happened. A Japanese survivor named Hiroshi Takeda was there. He remembered a small boy, thin, bloated, face almost unrecognisable, saying in Japanese the same two words over and over: "Mummy, water." 130,000 people died in Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 14th. The war was over. Oppenheimer spent the rest of his life trying to close the door he had opened. He opposed the hydrogen bomb, the weapon that would make the atomic bomb look modest. He argued for international control of nuclear weapons. He used whatever influence he had left to push against the arms race that he understood, with the clarity of the man who had built its first component, was not a race that had a finish line. In 1954, the government that had needed him to build the bomb decided he was a security risk. His clearance was revoked at a hearing that his former colleague Edward Teller attended to testify against him. The physicist who had directed the most important scientific project in American history was stripped of his access to the work that had defined his life. He died in 1967, lung cancer. He had smoked heavily since Los Alamos. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949. By the 1950s, both superpowers were building hydrogen bombs. By the height of the Cold War, there were 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world, enough to destroy every city on Earth multiple times with weapons to spare. The men who had lain on the desert floor in New Mexico on the morning of July 16, 1945, had not built a weapon, they had built a condition of human existence. Permanent, background, inheritable knowledge that the civilization could end, not slowly, not through the accumulated degradation of disease or poverty or climate, but in the specific, operational, scheduled way that weapons end things, was now the permanent context within which every human being on Earth was living. The Trinity test did not end the war. The bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war, but Trinity began something that the war's ending did not end, something that Hiroshima did not resolve and Nagasaki did not close, and the Soviet test of 1949 confirmed as permanent, and every subsequent test and every subsequent weapon confirmed further. The bomb was not the end of the story. It was the story's new terms, the terms under which every human being alive today is living, whether they think about it or not, whether they know Oppenheimer's name or not, whether they have ever heard of the Jornada del Muerto or Trinity or Los Alamos, or a Hungarian physicist lying in a bathtub in 1933 thinking about chain reactions. The chain reaction he imagined in that bathtub is still running. It has never stopped. If this story stayed with you, if Oppenheimer and Szilard and the 155 scientists who tried to stop what they had built mean something to you, there are more of them waiting. Every war, every empire, every decision that changed everything. Subscribe to the Dash Docs and stay.